if we wind back the clock, so to speak, could you help our viewers with providing a sort of a 5-10 minute summary of the entire Israel-Palestine conflict? What is the history behind it? What are the origins behind it? Be grateful if you could tell us all about that.
Oh, see, the question is, how far do you want me to go? Because if you want a complete 10 minutes history, I'll have to go back 3,500 years
Right.
for us to understand what this is. So, should I start 3,500 years back?
Start wherever you think is the most important point, I would say.
See, there's no such thing as the most important point because all of it is relevant to what's happening today. You can't discuss today without discussing 3,500 years back because it has to do with identity. The Jewish identity and the so-called Palestinian identity. So what happens is we know for a fact that these tribes around Israel they existed 3,500 years back. They were pagan. They worshipped a multitude of gods, of whom one was Jehovah, Yahweh, as we know, also called Baal and El and things like that, from which Allah, Elahi, Allah comes. The word Allah comes, who was the thunder god. And 3,500 years back was our first experiment with monotheism anywhere in the world, which a pharaoh called Akhenaten started in Egypt. And what Aten was the disk of the sun. So as long as he was co-ruler with his father, it was henotheism, where Aten was worshipped above all others, but everybody else was also worshipped. But then when he became pharaoh himself, he banned the worship of everybody else and focused on Aten. His empire collapsed. There was a general collapse of the Egyptian empire. But this notion somehow, is it carried on? Is it not? Did people remember this experiment? Did they not? We will never know. Anyway, sometime about 100, 200 years after this, presumably a story starts that Jews were held in captivity in Egypt. And, Moses liberates them and they all move to uh, 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 Israel. We know for a fact this is complete codswallop because we know the story itself was concocted 1,000 years later. Right? And how do we know this? Because the oldest description really goes back to about 1177 BC, which is the firm date of the Bronze Age collapse. And what happens out there is you have these Mediterranean raiders called the Sea People. Some are called the Shardana, but one is very specifically identified as the Peleset. And this particular people called the Peleset, the name coincides with the Hebrew word for invader, which is Palaishtu. And what happens is they set up these colonies along the Levantine coast, which become permanent colonies at that point of time, right? But the main impact of this is the word that it creates in Hebrew, which is Palaishtu, which means invader.
Yeah.
Now, these people are not native to there. Palaishtu obviously come from somewhere else to be called invader, but they adopt all the local gods. Now, at this point, the Palaishtu and the Hebrews were worshipping the exact same gods, contrary to what the Bible tells you. The main difference seems to have been ethnic, and that the fact that the people in the hills around Jerusalem is a hilly area, were not eating pork at all. There was some kind of a taboo on pork, whereas the people on the coast worshipping the same gods were consuming copious quantities of pork. Anyway, what happens is the Paleshtu get overcome by the people living in the hills, which becomes the so-called unified kingdom of Israel, which most people think didn't exist. And then it splits between a northern part called Israel and a southern part called Judah, which are slowly over the course of 200-300 years decimated by the Assyrians and the Egyptians and all of this. Now, what happens is because there are too many power centers, many gods means many priestly hierarchies, which means several different political power centers compared to the king. One of these kings, called Hezekiah, suddenly goes into the temple of Yahweh, which is just one of several temples of several gods being worshipped by the proto Jews at this time. And he says, "Oh my God, look at this. I have found these two tablets, which are the 10 Commandments of God, which were given to a chap called Moses 500 years back. concocted out of thin air, incidentally. And the story later develops 200 years down the line that this all happened in Egypt, because 200 years down the line, Assyria wasn't the main enemy, Egypt became the main enemy. So it made sense to have a pharaoh called Nesho was invading the Levant. That is how the story of the Exodus develops. All the genetic evidence shows you that the Hebrews have always been living out there. They do not have any extraneous this thing, other than natural mixing. Because of after they left their country and everything, they've gotten a lot of admixture. But I challenge anybody who's been to Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel to differentiate between an Israeli and a Jordanian, Israeli and a Syrian, and an Israeli and a Lebanese person. You cannot tell the difference. You simply cannot tell the difference, because they all look kind of European. They could easily pass off as Italians or Greeks. So it's a fantastic admixture. Nobody's pure blood out here. Remember, it's a great melting pot, because the Romans used to call it Mare Nostrum, RC, and that's what the Mediterranean was called. And it was a great melting pot. Rome had Arab emperors. It had two Arab emperors. One chap was called Philip the Arab, who was an Arab, and the other was a guy called Heliogabalus, who, curiously enough, was the original name for Jehovah, El Gabal. So El Gabalus becomes Heliogabalus or whatever. Sorry, I'm getting into too much detail, aren't I? But anyway,
No, it's good.
because these are issues of identity. Remember, it's very complex to negotiate identity issues. Anyway, we come to the Roman period. There's a big rebellion against Rome, because what happens is the Greeks don't insist that you worship their gods, but the Romans do, because paying homage to the divine emperor is part of the Roman way of showing that you accept you are a Roman citizen. But Hezekiah's monotheism and saying there is only Jehovah as per these 10 commandments means you cannot accept any other God. And so there is a rebellion in 72 AD, which is crushed and the Jews are dispersed, but then they're allowed to come back after 10, 15 years. But the latent causes do not go away. But what happens is Jerusalem is renamed Aelia Capitolina, the temple is destroyed, and a temple of Jupiter is built in place of the Jewish temple of Jehovah out there. Again, you can't worship the emperor, you refuse to worship the emperor. Another rebellion comes out in either 148 or 138 or maybe 130 AD, sometime 130 years AD ish. And this time the Romans are very clear, we're going to disperse you all, you're not allowed to come back. Over 100 years, Rome becomes 100, 200 years, Rome becomes Christian. And by this time, Christianity, remember, you started off as a Jewish branch.
Mhm.
But Peter and Paul realized two things. One, if it could not grow in the Roman Empire if Rome was the enemy that crucified its God. So they invent the story of Pontius Pilate washing his hands and leaving the decision up to the Jewish priesthood called the Sanhedrin, who insists that Jesus will be crucified. So the blame for the crucifixion is removed from Rome. Rome was innocent. It was the Jewish priests who did it. And the second, they get rid of their dietary requirements of eating pork because they realize it can't spread. The same way that as long as Buddhism hung on to vegetarianism, it could not spread. The moment it allowed you to eat absolutely anything, it conquered the whole of East Asia, right? They realized this, they made the modifications. The problem was when Rome, so first you've made it friendly with Rome, and then the more problematic aspect is the Jews killed our God. And that is where blood libel and hatred starts off. And so when the Roman Empire becomes Christian, the hatred of the Jews becomes ideological. It's no longer a matter of good governance keeping the Jews away from their land. It is now an ideological issue that God killers can't be allowed to thrive. And there is a Christian restriction against usury, which is to say money lending and interest, which complicates things a lot more. Okay, now What ends up happening is, I'm going to fast forward through European history, because everybody thinks history is European history, and so I'm not going to go through all the pogroms and things like that in the Middle Ages and things. Just very simply to say that, why these pogroms happened is because Christians were not allowed to lend money. It Only the Jews could lend money. And there were only two communities in Europe at that time: Christians and Jews. Pagans were killed off. Jews are kind of Christians, so they can't be killed off, but they're the dirty Christians who killed our God. Christian aligned who killed our God. They're people of the book. But because they owe, lots of people owe them money, lots of powerful people owe them money. Every time a lord could not pay them money, he would invoke blood libel. They killed our God, and so they took my child and sacrificed him and drank his blood on their Saturday rituals. And the entire mob congregates and goes and kills off the Jewish moneylender and the community out there. It's a fantastic way of taking money and not having to pay back your debt. And that was the root of several pogroms that happened throughout Europe. All of this changes with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. It is no surprise that it is the Industrial Revolution that ends slavery and it leads to the emancipation of Jews. Because for industry, you can't have forced work. Industry needs quality control. Quality control is a function of labor. You cannot have slaves. You need motivated workers to do quality control. And that is why slavery is not conducive to quality control. And that is why you see the northern industrial American states liberate southern slaves. That is why Britain, which is turning industrial, starts championing anti slavery almost like proselytization, as does France, right? Purely because of industry, not out of the goodness of their heart or any Christian virtue or anything like that. At the same time, industry needs capital. It needs a steady stream of capital. It is not an agrarian economy. And a steady stream of capital means regulatory mechanisms and guaranteed payback mechanisms, where not paying back is penalized by the state, which is where Jews start getting emancipated because they ran all the capital out there. It wasn't out of the goodness of Europe's heart or the enlightenment that the Jew was emancipated. It was because the systems of money usury that had been left to the Jews, like scavenging, or things would be left to the Dalits in India, kind of thing, were left to the Jews because it was dirty work. Uh, provided that capital, and that is why Jews were then brought back in from the cold. Then, of course, you had the Holocaust and things, which I'm not going to go into. But before that, what happens is the First World War. Because remember, all these states, Israel, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, whatever, are all under the Ottoman Empire at this point of time.
Yeah.
Now, since the Roman province of Syria, Palestina, the Romans, when they renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina in 72 AD, they do not refer to it as a province of Judah anymore. They change the name to Syria Palestina. Why? Because they want to insult the Jews. They choose the name invader from Hebrew. It is done deliberately to insult them. The same way the Nalanda railway station is called Bakhtiyar Khilji station. Why?
Mm.
It is called Bakhtiyarpur. Why? It was named Bakhtiyarpur to reinforce the fact that we destroyed Nalanda and we want to show Turkish superiority. And that is why the Romans named that province Palestine, to crush. After they did to the Jews what was done to Nalanda, they had to show what is the most insulting term we can use: invader. So Syria of the invader was what it was named, Syria Palestina. That is the first real use of the word Palestina, other than the Peleshet, Palaishtu, which had about, and these people, Palaishtu could also be Jews today, by the way, the original Palaishtu. Uh, Now, what ends up happening out here is, since that province collapses when the Arabs take over, there is no Palestine at all. Uh, None of the Ottoman provinces were called Palestine. What is today Israel was divided into 4, 5 different counties or districts or what have you, or provincial divisions, none of which was called Palestine. When the Ottoman Empire is defeated in the First World War in 1920, the Allies impose terms on it, which is the entire Levant: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Kuwait, all have to be ceded to them. The north is given to France, the south and the east are given to Britain. And all these countries had great delusions of being inheritors of the Roman Empire, which is why even in London you will see lots of so-called Roman architecture. The statue of Boadicea, for example, is done in the Roman style. It is definitely not done in the Celtic style that Boadicea was a Celt. The British, named their part of that area as Palestine for the first time. And this is done under a treaty called the Treaty of Sèvres, which is, Sèvres porcelain, Limoges and Sèvres porcelain. Sorry, in English we say Sèvres, but we all know it's pronounced Sèvres. But the Treaty of Sèvres. And what happens in the Treaty of Sèvres is it does two things. For the first time in about 1,700 years, it reestablishes the name Palestine, and it recognizes the right of Jews to return to that place. Again, after about 1,800, 1,900 years. So here's the issue. If you accept that the creation of Palestine is legal, you have to accept that the right of the Jews to return is equally legal. You can't claim one is legal and the other is illegal. Right? Now, Jews coming in there leads to a great blossoming. This area was completely desertified. It wasn't a desert before Roman rule, but under Roman rule, it was desertified because of the military requirements out there. All the trees were chopped down, and things like that. And what ends up happening is that because the Jews are turning the land green, and they're employing lots of local Sunni Muslims, it leads to social friction because this is essentially a feudal empire on its last legs. And the Ottoman Empire, what was the ruling dispensation before. And Sunni groups don't like this because feudal lords are having their power taken away. People who they could control at any given point of time are now getting regular jobs with the Jews, agricultural jobs or industrial jobs, which these guys don't want because it reduces their power, it reduces their social control. And so they start off terrorism against the Jews, and the Jews respond in kind. So there's to and fro massacres happening out there. The Holocaust happens simultaneously, say 15, 20 years down the line. By this time, there is a significant majority of Jews in what is today northern Israel. And the UN partition plan then does something. They'll tell you the Jews were only 20%, but they were given 60% of the land. Not true. They were given 20% of the land which they were large, and they were given a huge chunk of land that was completely barren desert. I want our viewers to Google the Negev desert and tell me what the hell can grow in the Negev desert. Nothing, zero. All the Muslim majority areas were given to the Muslims. The desert was given to the Jews. They did not want that. And so when Israel declares independence in borders defined by the UN, they don't want to accept UN. They don't want to accept the treaty. They want to accept part of the Treaty of Sèvres that creates a Palestine that has never existed mentally. You name one Palestinian leader before 1920. Nobody will be able to name one. Name one prime minister of Palestine in exile or one leader of Palestine in exile before 1920. There is none. But I can name Jewish leaders who have identified themselves as either the king of Israel or the leader of global Jewry or whatever for the last 3,000 years. And they invade this newly formed state, which fights back very successfully. It creates borders. And what happens is, in this entire process, it leaves out two strips, what is called the West Bank and Gaza. Gaza is absorbed by Egypt and it is put under military rule. The West Bank is actually annexed by Jordan. Jordan annexes the West Bank, declares it Jordanian territory, doesn't put it under military rule. It is claimed that it is Jordan proper, which is why 2/3 of Jordan's population is actually Palestinian, so-called Palestinian. Right? And this is very problematic because after 88, King Hussein of Jordan is forced to give up his dreams of conquering the whole of Israel and calling it Transjordan. And so he accepts that the West Bank is actually Palestine. And the Palestinian identity is something that did not exist before 1920. If somebody tells you that Palestine has always existed, I'm sorry, the historical link between the Palaishtu to the Roman Syria Palestina to British Palestine is purely etymological. There is no historical connection between the two. Etymology is not history. Etymology is etymology, and history is history. Etymology is not ethnicity, right? So it is, and everybody wanted that plot of land for themselves. Egypt wanted it for itself. Jordan wanted it for itself. Jordan was much more honest in that it annexed. Egypt ran it as a military protectorate, the so-called Free Palestinian Government, whatever that meant. But that's how things roll. So, I leave it up to people to make their own choices, what is right and what is wrong out here, because I don't think people go far back enough in history to prehistory to figure out identity issues. And I think that's very important we go that far back to figure out identity issues. I'm sorry, I took up way too long.
No, that was absolutely brilliant. And I think more people should do exactly what you've just done and just go back in time, go back, look into the history, and you'll find all the answers there. Thanks for that.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.